Jake thought the fine for his uncared-for lawn was a mistake, but when he dug deeper, he uncovered a hidden law that could tear the city apart. When he walked into City Hall with proof, he never expected what happened next. But let's start from the beginning. Jake Carter had never cared much for suburban perfection. The pristine lawns of his neighbors didn't interest him. His was overgrown, wild, and free, just like him. As a software engineer, his days were consumed by coding, debugging, and meetings. Weekends were his only escape, and he certainly wasn't going to spend them pushing a lawnmower around. He knew his lawn wasn't the most manicured, but it wasn't a disaster either. There were a few tufts of grass here and there, and the occasional dandelion popped up, but nothing that would stand out as a true eyesore. He thought he was just being left alone to live his life. Then the letter came. $200. A fine for neglecting his lawn. Jake blinked in disbelief, then read it again. The words, official fine, and escalating charges seemed to jump off the page. His immediate reaction was anger. There was no way this was legitimate. But the shock wasn't just in the fine itself. It was who was behind it. Mrs. Thompson, his uptight neighbor, had been the one to complain. She had always eyed his yard with disapproval, making passive-aggressive comments about his lax attitude. Jake had never been one to engage with her, but it was clear now that she had made it her mission to get him fined. What hit hardest, though, was the realization that this wasn't some isolated gripe. The fine had the full weight of the city council behind it. It wasn't a joke or a one-time warning. He was being targeted, and he had no idea how deep this went. What had started as a simple neighborly annoyance had now become an official battle. A fine was just the beginning. Jake was boiling with rage. How could they do this to him? He'd worked hard for everything he had, and now he was being punished over something as trivial as a lawn. It was ridiculous. His yard wasn't a wild jungle. It was simply unkempt, the way he liked it. Yet here he was, slapped with a $200 fine because of Mrs. Thompson's petty complaints. But as the anger bubbled up inside him, Jake realized something. He couldn't just accept this. He wasn't the kind of guy who would roll over and let people push him around. There had to be something he could do about it. He wasn't going to let some outdated law ruin his peace of mind. Jake threw himself into research. He spent hours online, diving into local property codes, zoning laws, and city ordinances. His mind spun as he read through pages of dense legal language. But just when he was about to give up, he found something strange. A forgotten law from the 1800s, buried in the archives. It stated that the city council couldn't impose fines unless a formal complaint had been filed following a specific procedure. Mrs. Thompson, he realized, had never filed the necessary paperwork properly. The discovery hit him like a light bulb going off in the dark. This was his ticket out. He wasn't just going to roll over. He was going to fight back. And he had the law on his side. With his heart pounding in his chest, Jake felt a new fire inside him. The council had tried to play dirty, but now he had the upper hand. Armed with this knowledge, he could challenge the fine, expose the flaws in their process, and maybe even turn the tables on Mrs. Thompson. He wasn't about to let this injustice stand. The game had just changed. Jake walked into City Hall with a folder full of documents, his pulse quickening with each step. His mind was laser-focused on one thing, making sure his voice was heard. He didn't have much faith in the bureaucratic machine, but he wasn't going to let this go. Not now. Not after what he'd uncovered. When he confronted the officials, their reactions were exactly what he expected. Dismissive. They glanced at him like he was just another frustrated citizen trying to avoid a fine. One bureaucrat even sighed, clearly uninterested. But Jake didn't flinch. He opened the folder and began laying out his case, carefully and methodically, pointing out every flaw in the city's actions. As he spoke, something in the room shifted. The bureaucrat's indifference melted into surprise, then disbelief. Jake's words were landing. He wasn't just complaining. He was exposing a legal oversight that could make the fine not just unfair, but outright illegal. The officials, who'd been treating him like an inconvenience, now found themselves trapped in their own system. The room grew tense. The atmosphere shifted from routine office drudgery to something more charged. Jake wasn't backing down, and the officials knew it. He demanded a formal hearing, invoking his legal right under the law. Silence hung in the air as the bureaucrat hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the position Jake had put them in. They were cornered, and they knew it. With a reluctant nod, the bureaucrat agreed to the hearing. But Jake wasn't finished yet. As he continued to dig into the legalities, he unearthed another crucial detail. If the fine was deemed improperly applied, the city wouldn't just have to cancel it, they would have to compensate him. His heart raced as the full scope of the battle ahead dawned on him. This wasn't about a lawn anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, for exposing the cracks in a system that thought it could trample over him. He wasn't just fighting for his property, he was fighting for justice. The hearing took place 2 weeks later, and Jake entered the room with a mixture of determination and nerves. The atmosphere was tense, charged with anticipation. The council members sat in their usual positions, looking impassive, while a few residents, including Mrs. Thompson, filled the room. Jake could feel her eyes boring into him, her smug expression practically glowing with confidence. She was certain she had already won. Jake stood at the front, his hands barely noticeable as they twitched with the last remnants of nervousness. His palms were sweaty, but he steeled himself. His voice, however, betrayed no doubt. It was calm, steady, and clear as he began presenting his case. The council members flipped through the paperwork, but Jake was already on his game. He started with the basics, the fine. He pointed out how the paperwork was riddled with inconsistencies, the lack of a proper complaint, the procedural errors that made this fine not just unfair, but outright illegal. Each point he made seemed to chip away at the council's defense. The room, once filled with murmurs of indifference, grew quiet. Even the bureaucrats seemed to be paying attention now. Mrs. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Then Jake dropped the bombshell. The fine, if deemed invalid, wasn't just voided. The city was legally obligated to compensate him, a sum of $500 for issuing an invalid fine. The council members exchanged glances, their faces turning a shade paler. They hadn't expected this. Neither had Mrs. Thompson, who by now was no longer wearing her triumphant smirk. Her face, once full of self-assuredness, faltered as she registered what was happening. Her eyes widened. Her mouth opened slightly as she realized Jake had turned the tables on her, exposing the truth and making her the villain in this entire affair. Jake felt a small, almost imperceptible smile tug at the corner of his lips. He had come a long way from the angry man who had first seen that letter. He had fought back against a system that had tried to bulldoze over him, and now it was paying the price. As the council deliberated, Jake stood silently, his confidence swelling. They couldn't ignore the law. They couldn't pretend like he was just another citizen to be pushed aside. The feeling of the moment, of knowing that he had outmaneuvered them, was satisfying. He hadn't just won a technicality. He had made a point. He had shown them that there were consequences for abusing power. That there were people who would stand up and fight for what was right, even when it seemed like they didn't stand a chance. After what felt like an eternity, the council reluctantly agreed. They officially voided the fine and handed Jake the compensation. The crowd in the room was subdued, some exchanging looks of disbelief, others simply watching in stunned silence. Jake gathered his papers, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline, but his chest swelled with pride.